Okay, it's a few minutes after noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we continue to follow the horrors unfolding in Ukraine, including those emerging from Bucha this week, I'm really grateful to all of our panelists for sharing their expertise on issues relating to human security in the conflict. So before I introduce everyone, I just want to remind our attendees that we will take questions from the audience. So please feel free at any time to put questions in the Q&A feature. I'm pleased first to introduce Dr. Gemma Miralda, a member of the Faculty in Political Science, Dr. Paul Nelson, an associate professor of international development in GSPIA, Dr. Taylor Seybolt, Associate Professor of International Affairs in GSPIA, and especially grateful to Dr. Svitlana Maksymenko, a Senior Lecturer in Economics, GSPIA Adjunct Faculty, as well someone who can share some expertise on perspectives from Ukraine. And so now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Luke Condra, Associate Professor in International Affairs. Thank you all so much for being here and for taking the time to talk with us about this.
Thanks very much, Dr. Owen, and thanks to all of you for joining us. So this panel is convened, as Dr. Owen said, to share some insights from our panelists on the study of issues in human security to hopefully help us better understand, process some of the consequences of the war in Ukraine. I borrow from the words of my colleague, Dr. Seybolt, when I say that the study of human security is about addressing a question of fundamental importance to the functioning of society, and that is, how can we protect people from severe threats to their lives and livelihoods? And it draws on expertise from various disciplines to address issues of political violence, human rights, of governance, sustainable economic development, and much, much more. And critically, and I think we'll hear this from our panelists in discussion today, this approach puts individual well-being and empowerment at the center of analysis rather than states and governments. And it's making a bet that this will yield some answers to this question and policy relevant insights that we may not get otherwise. So to talk about some of these issues in this context, I'm very glad to be joined by my colleagues and looking forward to hearing from them to help us learn and reflect. So I wanted to start for all of our panelists with a question for everyone to reflect on. Has anything about the war maybe surprised you or challenged your understanding of some of the human security issues that you focus on in your research, in your teaching, and in your professional experience? So I wanted to start with that one. We could just go around for reflections on that. Anyone want to start?
I'll start.
Oh.
Go ahead, Gemma.
I just have two brief points. They have to do with speed, the word speed. I've been really surprised with the speed with which the humanitarian crisis has unfolded. It's just staggering the number of people that have crossed the borders and the ones that have been displaced. And then the second matter that sort of has caught my eye is from a student of, scholar of European integration and European migration policies, particularly in the southern border, the Mediterranean. The response of the EU, the rapid response that the EU has had on the humanitarian front with regards to financial and other assistance to Ukraine, as well as the EU member states on the front line of the exodus from the Ukraine, that to me has been unprecedented. And we will talk some more about what I think about the consequences of this rapid response. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We'll return to some of those. Go ahead. I'm
going to jump in because what has surprised me, and maybe it shouldn't have, relates directly to what you said, Gemma, and that's at the almost not only at the national level, but at the individual level, the response of people in Ukraine's neighbor countries has been surprising and moving. More on that later.
Yes, and I would like to jump to in this conversation. Yes, I agree that the speed of changes in the refugee crisis is extremely surprising. And, it looks like that in addition to speed, we are talking about extremely large numbers of refugees. It's when we had our panel, I believe in the second week of invasion, we were mentioning 400,000 people who crossed the borders. So now the numbers tell us that it's over 10 million of displaced people that we are talking about. And compared to the size of Ukraine with 45 million people, we are talking about 1/4 of population of the country. So there, so this wave of refugees just are overflown a lot of resources available in the European Union, but I was also quite pleasantly surprised how willing the European Union was to work with this issue and accept such a huge number of refugees and help those who are displaced back in Ukraine and the western part region of Ukraine.
So what surprises me most about this conflict is what underlies the observations that my colleagues just made on displacement and refugees. And what underlies them is the extreme brutality and the brazenness of the Russian military attacks on civilians. I have to admit that really surprised me. I expected the Russian military to be dominant and to take Kyiv within a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And instead they stalled and they decided, I don't know if it was part of their original plan or just an innovation, but they decided to focus on flattening civilian structures and killing civilians. There are laws and norms and rules of warfighting that are intended to limit the damage to the civilian population. And these are embodied in the Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, in the Charter of the UN, in the Rome Statute, which established the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and in normative concepts like the responsibility to protect and just war principles, particularly principles of distinction and proportionality, which I won't go into now, but I think we can talk about later. I know Russia's never been enthusiastic about civilian protection efforts. If you look at what they did in Afghanistan in the 70s and what they did in Chechnya in the 90s, but to have such a big and consequential country blatantly violate the tenets of civilian protection and basic human decency was quite surprising to me, and will certainly influence my thinking about it in the future.
Thanks very much to all of you. That all of that hits some themes that I think we'll return to in discussion as we go forward. So let me start with some individual questions for each of you. So Dr. Maksymenko, you're an expert on international and financial economics. You've written about issues related to economic growth in Ukraine specifically. This conflict is having huge economic impacts, both within Ukraine itself and globally. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the macroeconomic effects of the conflict that maybe you've been following, whether it be effects on the global economy or effects on Ukrainians themselves.
Absolutely, Luke. Thank you for bringing this issue first in the discussion. So I agree absolutely. The impact of war in Ukraine is tremendous. Not only on their markets in Ukraine, in Russia, in European Union, but globally. And sort of thinking about this impact, I think it's important to understand that we are not only talking about their market of merchandise, increase in the price of energy, their restrictions in supply of energy because of their sanction, and our expectation of increasing prices of food because Russia and Ukraine together account for about 1/3 of supply of wheat and grains in the global markets. But we are also talking about their uncertainty that investors face with regard to Eastern Europe, right? So now a lot of projects that were started, investment projects in Russia and in Ukraine are frozen because of the conflict. And we are talking about billions of dollars. We also have to think about the disruption in their supply chain of many merchandise. If we think about their, for example, air communication, right? So the airspace above Ukraine, above Russia is closed. So it creates a tremendous impact on their airline industry, both cargo and passenger flights. And of course, the possibility of Russia's default due to their frozen assets and inability to service its debt. So eventually, it's hard to predict, but it might resonate heavily in the financial markets, and especially in the markets of many emerging economies. So this impact is folded and probably will even unfold further as war continues. So just a note to give some, let's say, ideas to our listeners about, let's say, what sanctions on Russian economy can or potentially can do impacting the global market. I would like to share my screen. So I prepared this file which illustrates the top Russian export commodities which are now under sanctions, and our audience can take a look about their value in billion US dollars of their exported petroleum products, coal, wheat, semi-finished products. Diamond industry surprisingly is also under sanctions, and thus Russia will not be able to supply these products. And we are not talking about just the diamonds for jewelry, but we are talking about the commercial diamonds that are used heavily in production. And of course, a lot of chemicals that Russia exports a lot. So all these markets now will experience changes in the supply, right? So, and as a result, it's normal to expect that the prices of this merchandise will increase in the nearest future. So, unfortunately, supply of almost all of these products is not very easily replaceable, right? So, a lot of mineral resources have also are geography specific, and it's extremely quite complicated to fill in a very short period of time. So in this sense, I think it's reasonable to expect that a lot of households in Europe and probably all around the world would have to tighten the belts and experience their increase in prices, especially in food and energy, on their budgets as consumers. And another interesting issue is about the impact of this war on their global economy, and probably eventually on their many financial institutions, international financial institutions that I would like to bring up is their damage. It's a devastation that was done in the territory of Ukraine. So it has been a recent study published by my colleagues from Kiev School of Economics. So they estimated, I believe, $68 billion worth of damages and destructions done in the Ukrainian economy. And I believe about 80% of it includes infrastructure, roads, buildings, railways, airports, and so on. So, and of course, housing residential housing. So we are talking about a need for Ukraine for a huge investment in the nearest future, probably from their large financial institutions abroad, to help to restore these damages. So as of now, it's my understanding that it's too early to talk about any loans or any, financial assistance. But I think as soon as the war is over and the security of the land feels like closer to their peaceful future. So we will be talking about movement of funds, again, either in the forms of grants or loans, or maybe foreign direct investment, probably to restore, to rebuild this infrastructure. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that. It's really enlightening. I mean, two things come out of that, and thinking about as you said, the rising costs of basic needs items like food and energy, and we're already seeing some unrest globally, purportedly linked to some of these rising costs in food and energy, and that are partly a result, as you said, of sanctions and supply chain disruptions, and then the other is kind of these long run effects of the war on Ukrainian economy and infrastructure that are going to take years to rebuild. I don't know if other panelists have thoughts or questions about that. Always feel free to jump in. But that was very interesting to learn more about. May return to some of those themes in a bit. So let me move to Dr. Marolda and return to a point that was raised earlier in the opening comments, and that's about migration and refugee flows. As Dr. Maksymenko mentioned, we're seeing historic numbers in terms of flows of refugees in this conflict. Maybe over 10 million Ukrainians have fled to neighboring countries at this point, a further 6.5 million displaced within Ukraine itself. So what are some of the economic, political consequences of these flows likely to be in the short and the long run? Do you think any of this will change the contentious politics surrounding migration policy in Europe that we had seen, at least coming up to the beginning of this war, where citizens were already debating how and whether to accommodate refugees and migrants who were fleeing violence, particularly from the Middle East?
Right.
There we go.
Yes. So yes, very much so. We start seeing a lot of voices on the double standard that Europe has shown with respect to migration policies in general. With its reaction toward what's happening in Ukraine, to sort of the MENA region and primarily the Mediterranean region. So definitely, I think this is a real turning point with respect to European response in many different ways. But let me just, if I can unpack a little bit, because your question has a lot. So I have a few comments on the economic side, and then obviously on the political side. Obviously, Europe is facing one of the fastest growing refugee crises since the World War II, with what's happening in Ukraine. And some of the numbers, obviously, we know 10 million. At this point, as of April 2nd, we have UNHCR has come out with 6.5 million people internally displaced, and then 4.1 million have crossed the border. That's about 9.1% of the Ukraine pre-invasion population, which was about 41.1 million. Now, of those, it's also interesting to see for political, to discuss the political dimension of this, where are the Ukrainians moving to? And of course, Poland is receiving the bulk of it with 2.4 million. And then ranking just below is Romania with over 635,000. And Moldova with 392,000, and then of course Hungary with 385,000 refugees. Believe it or not, 350,000 are crossing into the Russian border, into Russia. So of course the economic cost of helping millions of Ukrainians fleeing the war will be pretty staggering. Early estimates from the Center for Global Development show that the cost just in the first year could go as high as $30 billion. And so I think these costs will weigh heavily, primarily on Europe, and because this basically includes food and shelter provision for the refugees, and as well as administrative costs of processing and settling the refugees, which is quite a bit. So we have to also think in terms of Europe still recovering from the pandemic, dealing with supply chain shortages and high inflation, just as we are feeling it on this side of the Atlantic. But I think that although we're looking at short-term cost as being pretty high, I think personally the long-term costs will be perhaps even greater for Europe, because Europe has responded by allowing not just the movement of population into European states, but is allowing, from a legal standpoint and a financial standpoint, integration of Ukrainian refugees with respect to not just housing, but labor, employment, education, healthcare. So these systems are going to be pretty stressed in the short term and of the long run as well, because we have to see, it all depends on when the conflict will end and how many will be willing to return home. There are so many stories now in the media about many of these refugees that want to go back, but go back where? Because it as it was just said, 80% of the infrastructure is destroyed in the country. So therefore, it's going to take some time. In the meantime, Europe will have to shoulder this. With respect to the political dimension, if I can jump a little bit back and forth, we have to also understand and put in perspective, and I think this is important for my own work in the southern European border. We have to put this conflict, or sort of the humanitarian perspective of Ukrainian outflows within a crisis context. if you think about it, the Syrian civil war, which started in 2011, produced more refugees than any other crisis since the 1960s. There are about 6.9 million Syrian, about a third of the pre-war population that live outside the country. And 3.7 million are now in Turkey. And then there is obviously another just as much, 6.8 million that are internally displaced. Afghanistan, we mentioned before, more than 2 million people, refugees produced every year since 1981, with a peak in 1990, just as the Soviets left, and it displaced 6.3 million people. And finally, even Venezuela, it has one of the largest population outflows in modern times, about 15% of the population. We have about, the UNHCR reports 5 million Venezuelans that are refugees in other countries. So we need to, when we talk about the political consequences, it is important to put this into context, because it is what we get from the media about what's happening. It obviously gives us a sense of emergency, but it's not the only area where we need to be responsive and creating human-centered policies and practices. With respect to the economic response, so Europe has responded to Ukraine, and I'll make 5 points, and I am happy to go in the Q&A more in depth. I did not prepare slides for this, but I have numbers, specific numbers that I can also provide at a later point for people that would like to see. But on the humanitarian support front, number one, Europe, the Commission has allocated 500 million euro from the EU budget, and 29 countries in addition are delivering over 100 million euro in supplies through the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. A second response point from the EU with respect to protection of people fleeing the war, really seriously record time activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, which means looking after the security of people in need, meaning activating laws and regulations in all 27 EU members with regards to welfare support, access to job, and education. That is unprecedented. And number three, it has the EU has launched supporting border management. It has not only in terms of guidelines, but it has sent Frontex border guards, extra staff to ensure that there was that we can process into Europe the passage a quick and secure crossing. And number four, also very unprecedented, cohesion policy action. So cohesion policy in the EU is that sort of policy domain whereby the EU makes funding available to address economically depressed regions within areas at the subnational level. And states tap into those funds to sort of address the uneven geography, economic geography that is throughout Europe. Well, this policy domain now has been applied for refugees in Europe, particularly the Ukrainians. And so there is an unprecedented new proposal to use these funds for investments on education, employment, housing, healthcare, and childcare services, and then basic material assistance. And lastly, the EU has launched a large-scale support to Ukraine by allocating an emergency macro financial assistance of 1.2 billion euro in loans to Ukraine, and then an additional 120 million euros to Ukraine in budget support. So these are just 5 of the areas that the EU has acted. If you go back to 2015, the so-called migrant crisis with the refugees from people fleeing Syria mostly, but not just Syria. Back in 2015, there was nothing of this kind of responsiveness and really humanitarian help. And I'll be happy to go into details in any of these areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, one kind of quick follow-up, or I don't know if it's quick or not, but that made me think of when you were just talking about the differences in responsiveness across space and across different groups. I mean, does this seem to you then that, I mean, one of the worries, right, that we had leading up to from 2010 onward was that migration flows into Europe primarily from the Middle East, North Africa, were contributing to rightward shifts in policy platforms for certain European governments, becoming more nationalist, becoming more xenophobic, and related kind of policy shifts. Does this mean we shouldn't worry as much about this new migration flow causing those same kinds of responses amongst European neighbors because of the nature of the migrants being different in how they look and in their culture from what had come before?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. I definitely see a difference in the way the Ukrainian people are viewed and received in Europe. There is a sense that they are Europeans, that they are very close to Europe. So the geography and the language and the culture and the history is definitely an element, or elements that colored that kind of vision, which is not there when we are talking about refugees from the North Africa and the Middle East. Perhaps it is mixed with respect to the southern EU states, because obviously they're part of the Mediterranean region. But as you well know, now also the EU states, southern states, have had very strong tendency toward far right and populist parties that have risen on the platform, on the immigration platform. So it is going to be very different. I think at this point, I personally think there is a window of opportunity for Europe to redress some of the policies and practices in managing migration across the different, sort of around its external borders, in light of what's happening with Ukraine. So let me just say that the very countries, so two of the things that Europe hasn't been able to do since the migrant crisis of the 2015, with the inflows of migrants and refugees, is reform of the Dublin regulations, which regulates the movement of people within the European bloc. And there's a sheer lack of consensus among member states to a sort of an equitable distribution of migrants and refugees. And the very countries that have opposed any sort of consensus building of any sort, any sense of sort of progress toward reforms of the regulations, are the very countries today, and Poland and Hungary are the two top ones, the very countries who are now flooded with Ukrainian people. So I think this is a turning point for Europe. I really think, and I hope, a turning point for a more human-centered policy all around. So.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to, Gemma, thank you very much for such detailed overview of economic and political consequences of the refugee crisis that is emerging from Ukraine. I would also like to bring one more point, which probably identifies this movement of people is the fact that due to martial law in Ukraine, male population of age 16 to 60 cannot leave the country. So their demographic distribution that we see of those refugees is quite unique. So we're talking about extremely large number of female population, elderly population, and children. So in terms of their further impact on economic situation in those countries that accept them, so neither elderly population nor children can join the labor force, and females historically in Ukraine end up being taking care of the elderly and children. So the labor market opportunity for those female who left would be quite limited, not only in terms of the industries where they can end up, but also by the fact that they are used to taking care of their family members, and they might not be even willing to join the labor force because of these responsibilities for the elderly. Mm-hmm.
If I may respond very quickly, I think it's a great point, and yes, and much needed to be made. The demographic difference, yes, and I think it is also an important point, not just from an economic standpoint, but it's for because of the gender element. I think that the humanitarian protection and safety is even more important to be concerned about. However, yes, and I take your point because of the cultural, societal, traditional element of the Ukrainian family structure. You're going to see some of this, but I suspect that the EU already has in plan, many of the national programs are going to have childcare services available. And even though it will be difficult, I think in the short term, I think people are going to be allowed to be on a welfare system, so to speak, but not for the long term. So if eventually, as these family unit or partial family units will stay in the EU, they will have to be integrated also into the labor market, because I don't think the stress would be too much. And I just think that at that point, you will have that populist element that is going to grow in the face of that.
Thanks very much for that. That was great. I feel like I understand the dynamics of some of these dynamics of migration and the consequences of it much better for those points that you both made. So thank you. I want to pivot now to a little bit of a different direction. Go to Dr. Nelson. A question for you. It's kind of broad, but it's really trying to draw on your experience studying and working with humanitarian agencies. A lot of attention has been on government's efforts to address human suffering, and Dr. Marolda was just pointing out some of those. But what has the humanitarian crisis maybe taught us or reminded us about the role that non-governmental organizations can play in addressing human security problems?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. And I will focus strictly on the kind of short-term humanitarian needs, certainly not because I think it's the most important or the only important factor. That it's just critically important, for example, that we be doing the dangerous, challenging, essential work of documenting abuses that we see and allegations of abuses in order to be able to pursue human rights remedies and remedies in international law. But the short-term needs of the huge number of people that we've heard described as displaced within Ukraine's borders and as refugees, and the many other who are, can we use the term, sheltering in place within the country, requires our attention too. And what's striking to me is the extent to which the lessons that we've learned, that international humanitarian practitioners have learned in other situations that in many ways look quite different from Ukraine. Those lessons have turned out to be very relevant, and we see them being acted out and followed. And I have a couple of images as well. So let me put this up on the screen. I'm going to stay with that format. First, it's as I said at the outset, I just find it striking and moving, the response not only of the EU governments, but of people in the neighboring countries, communities who we see doing things like these people in a German train station, taking refugees into their homes. Those huge numbers of Ukrainians who have fled are provoking this kind of response. And Gemma Miralda has already spoken some about sort of that this flies in some ways in the face of political trends in the recent past. At the national level, it's also true in this case, as it has been in all of the recent cases in the last generation that I can think about, that it is the neighboring countries who are hosting the refugees, and I think likely will continue to host them. And these numbers just bear out what my colleagues have said. But on the right of the screen, you can see the countries worldwide who are hosting the most refugees, and it's not hard to line up Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, and so on with the neighboring countries whose people they've taken in. This is important to how the United States responds. When President Biden announced in the last couple of days that the United States would begin the process of taking in 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, of course, that's a welcome step. And it will be, I believe it'll be good for our society as well. Equally important was the commitment of $1 billion through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to help and support the countries and even the communities and institutions that are hosting these much larger numbers. That's an obligation and an opportunity, I think, that countries much further from Ukraine have, and that we have to follow through on. Third observation about humanitarian practice in this situation is that we seem to have learned the lesson that cash is usually, maybe almost always, the best form of assistance. What's illustrated here is a displaced Ukrainian getting registered for one of the several cash assistance funds through UNHCR and being administered by the Postal Service in Ukraine. And this reflects a sort of larger change and larger trend in humanitarian practice where even the US food aid programs, which were begun as much as a way of getting rid of our surpluses as of providing assistance, even those programs are now increasingly financing cash assistance that allows people to buy food that's available on the market. Because here, as in many other cases, usually it's not the food supply that's a constraint. Final point about this: the donor countries are cooperating in an encouraging way. Many of the donors are putting their funds into what's called a pooled country fund within the UN's Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which allows money to be spent where it's needed most, not where a donor country can best fly the flag and get credit for it. That's to be encouraged, and it's heartening to see it in this case. Yes, I would close by reinforcing the point that Gemma, that you made earlier, that the crisis in Ukraine has seized our attention, and geopolitically, the situation in Ukraine is different from other cases, but in human terms, refugees and people in distress in Syria, in Ethiopia, in Afghanistan demand our attention as strongly as does Ukraine. And I just call your attention to a report that the humanitarian organization CARE has done. They do almost annually a report on underreported humanitarian crises. And this year's report, or last year's, makes a strong case for more and more effective media coverage of those crises.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's really enlightening to think about kind of immediate. Gemma, please go ahead. Immediate kind of responses.
Because your first point, I just wanted to say about this trend of people just showing up at the train station and offering a room, or I think you brought up a very good point, which there are some reports now that are illustrating the danger of this trend. And I think we have in the chat this a question about is it likely to see, are we going to see a rise in human trafficking? And this is a very good point, especially because of the demographics. I suspect that is going to happen because there are already reports that women with children are very vulnerable. They have left their country with nothing on their back and just to and away from the center of their life, their husbands, their loved ones, and I think that they feel in that uncertainty very vulnerable and sometimes unable to distinguish if somebody is very genuinely offering the help. And so I would say that NGOs need to have a very strong sort of role here in advertise that what you want to do is go to a legit place and not necessarily take. I know it's an unfortunate thing because you want to give the opportunity to people from everywhere to open their homes. But I think the incident of people smuggling and trafficking is going to be something that we need to really watch in this next few months. So that's it.
Go ahead, Taylor. Yeah.
I just want to echo what Gemma was saying and note that there's already a pattern of trafficking from Eastern European countries to Western European countries and the rest of the world. So this is a situation where the supply, if you will, of people, particularly young girls, is feeding into a system that's already there. And that means that it's probably happening now, and we should be paying a lot of attention to it.
Yes, go ahead. You're muted, Dr. Maksymenko.
Sorry. I would also like to add up that I agree with the point that Paul made about the importance of cash assistance during this crisis and how it's different from other crisis that we experienced in the past with refugees. So no, this time it looks like that refugees end up in their European country where markets are functioning properly, right? So there is a huge availability of food, clothing in stores. So we are not talking about delivery of this in-kind assistance to territories that were struck by the earthquake or flood or volcano eruption, whereas there is no supply chain. So the delivery of very often some aid, in-kind aid takes weeks. So sometimes even months, taking their shipping challenges through the Atlantic Ocean, especially from the North America. So the fact that their financial markets are working quite well and the ability of cash to help this displaced family so showed that this time actually it's quite an interesting fact, right? So if there are refugees who arrive just with a single backpack on a train or only with one luggage and one mom and 3 or 4 children with a single luggage that she was able to carry, so the fact that she has access to some cash support so she can purchase everything that she needs locally. And this is something that differentiate the need for cash this time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just would add that to the extent that NGOs are participating in that cash assistance, and they are, this will be a test of their individual donors' sophistication, ability to be satisfied with the idea that their cash donation is translated into cash that gets into the hand of the person you just described, Svitlana, as opposed to seeing their blankets or food packs or other things delivered.
Just a quick note on that. That's actually one of the arguments in favor of cash. It's much more efficient to pass on cash from a cash donation than to buy blankets and package them up and send them and all the friction that involves.
I mean, one observation from all this that I thought of is listening to all of you talk throughout this. It goes back to a point you made at the outset, Dr. Marolda, about speed and the rapidity with which this crisis unfolded. And it strikes me that what we're hearing from all of you is that creates different sets of problems on different dimensions that are more or less easy to fix with different kinds of assistance. Maybe the macroeconomic side can be a little bit faster, can be be quicker to give loans, to allocate money at a macro level. But then you have some unintended consequences that arise out of trying to give humanitarian assistance that could result in things like a surge in trafficking, which is I don't know, something to think about is how speed affects the degree to which you can solve some of these problems. Okay, so I want to go last, but certainly not least, to Dr. Seybolt to talk about a different aspect of the conflict. And one of the things you study is the dynamics of civilian protection and harm in conflict zones. And in the last week in particular, I've noticed that there's mounting discussion in the press and amongst politicians of the need to hold Russia accountable for apparent atrocities committed against civilians in Ukraine. President Biden has called them war crimes, though he's stopped short of calling it genocide. President Zelensky has and addressed the UN Security Council in a pretty impassioned speech. How should we two questions come out of this. How should we understand Russian forces targeting of civilians in such brutal, intentional, seemingly indiscriminate ways? You noted that at the outset in your observations. And then separately on accountability, what are the mechanisms available to the West through which they could hold Russia accountable for its actions, either now in discussions that are ongoing that we're seeing playing out, or after the conflict ends?
Well, thank you for such simple questions. Let me take them in order. So I'll talk about how we maybe can understand or try to understand the Russian military targeting civilians so brutally and apparently comprehensively everywhere they have gone. There is a trail of civilians, dead civilians left behind. So it's not just a couple of rogue units within the military. It seems to be throughout the Russian military practice to attack civilians. And it's hard to comprehend. The reporting that is available, the reporting that's available to us is extraordinary in that, hold on. I'm losing my voice. It's extraordinary the extent to which we see evidence in almost real time on our screens. So we know that it's happening, and in Russia, they think they know that it's not, because that's what their national media is telling them. So this is something that the government of Russia, Putin's administration, seems to know should be hidden from people, and yet they blatantly engage in civilian targeting and leave the evidence behind. So how can we understand this? Well, I mentioned at the outset the international norms and laws that are designed to limit the violence visited upon civilians during wartime. And that is a set of ideas and practices that has been given a lot of attention in the last 30 years or so, since the end of the Cold War. But there's still obviously a throwback in some countries to a period when civilians didn't merit treatment different from an opposing soldier. So how can we understand this? Well, one possibility, and I'm going to go through a few possibilities. I don't think any of them are adequate to explain what we've seen, but perhaps together they give us something. First is that the Russian military might have a theory of victory that involves coercing and terrifying civilians as a method of control. And Luke, your work has shown that to be a mistaken belief, that coercing and killing civilians actually makes the military objectives harder to obtain, military and political objectives. But for a long time, there's been counterinsurgency doctrine in various forms around the world that says you should intimidate the population and, if necessary, eliminate them. Mao's famous dictum about draining the sea so that you could find the fish, the sea being the civilian population and the fish being the insurgents. So that's one possible answer. It's obviously problematic in moral terms. It seems to be problematic in practical terms. The Russians aren't victorious. So another possibility is that there's the belief that the civilian population should be, will be punished. Punished for what? It's not clear. But the way you motivate individual soldiers sometimes is to say that what you're doing is just and right, and that these people have done something wrong. This is genocidal thinking and argumentation, and so you need to punish them because we are superior. And I think there's probably some of that going on. The talk of Nazis in Ukraine, which throws back to World War II era, obviously, is part of that punishment mentality. And then there's the old standby for individuals. They were just following orders. This was an argument or an excuse that came out in the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War, where people tried to excuse their behavior by saying, I was just doing what I was told. And that's an inadequate, I think, answer in any level. So what all of this, just to skip ahead a little bit, is what one thing that we can say for sure is that this kind of behavior of attacking civilians displays a rejection of international standards by the Russian government. It's Russia against the world in Putin's view, or so we're told. And there's a mentality that if the West is attempting to enhance their protection of civilians, and I'll come to that in a moment, then it must be wrong. That Russia is apart from the rest of Europe and obviously from the US, and doesn't have to abide by, will not abide by the standards of behavior that are so dictated to them by other governments. And the last point I'll make on how we should understand this is to contrast it with NATO efforts to improve protection of civilian doctrine and practice, particularly since the experience in Afghanistan. There has been a very interesting combination of organizations, NGOs, the US military, other militaries, and NATO in particular as an alliance, as a pact, to pay more attention to protecting civilians in conflict. And they're developing doctrine, and they're conducting tabletop exercises, and there are now handbooks on how to protect civilians, not as an adjunct to military practice, but as a core concern, because it's fundamental to modern ideas of human rights and human dignity that you don't attack people who are not a threat to you. So that's your first question. Your second question, what are the mechanisms through which the West could hold Russia accountable for its actions now and in the future? Again, my answer is not going to be very satisfying, I'm afraid, because there is a limit, a pretty severe limit to what can be done. First of all, let me distinguish between holding Russia accountable and holding Putin and other individuals accountable. Holding Russia accountable as a country, as a government and a people and a territory is already underway. It's pretty much the same as the efforts through sanctions and embargoes and diplomatic maneuvers and the provision of military supplies to Ukraine to try to stop Russia's advance and deny them their military victory. So it's holding the country to account is not that different from trying to lead to a Russian defeat. Holding Putin and other individuals to account, there are a couple of ways that that can be done. One is naming and shaming, to which I say, there's no chance that we can shame Putin into changing his behavior. I don't, unless somebody has knowledge about his style and personality that I haven't heard. He's demonstrated, and the Russian military has demonstrated that they don't feel shame about what they're doing, except that there is a little opening there because the Russian people are not being told by the national media exactly what's going on, or even close to what's going on. So naming and shaming is one option. Taking him out of power is another. Taking away his power, which means overthrowing the Russian government. That's problematic in obvious ways. There's taking his wealth, which is an effort that is underway, I believe. And there's taking his freedom, which is putting him on trial in the International Criminal Court. But to do that, he has to be indicted by the court and then captured and brought to The Hague. And that's obviously problematic as well. So there is a real need to hold him to account and his leading military commanders, I would say also, but I'm not optimistic that it's going to happen. Sorry, I didn't on such a down note.
No, that's very helpful. Let me in a follow-up, let me on that last point that you made, Taylor, let me use one of the questions that's been in the Q&A for a bit to float it to you and others what you think. I mean, you mentioned that there is some degree of kind of asymmetry in information here with respect to the Russian population, not knowing, not being aware as much of what may be going on. Let's imagine that were changed in some respect. This kind of goes to the question, how effective are nonviolent methods of action, such as mass protests and ameliorating human security challenges, et cetera, or I should say like in kind of in that accountability framework. So, imagine that you get that information asymmetry resolved in some way or mitigated. Does that spur the kind of mass protests that would threaten the regime enough to change behavior? Or that's my version of the question a little bit.
It's possible. It's so that's basically a people power argument that even in an autocratic government like Putin's Russia, that the government does have to pay attention to what the people will tolerate and stay within limits. I'm not a Russia specialist by any stretch, and I would like to hear from somebody who is. If we have people who know about the Russian internal balance of power within their government, but as far as I can tell, this is an administration that's built around a single man, and it's going to be awfully hard to have people power influence the government enough to change in that situation. A variation on people power effectively, influencing the political leader is to have it effectively, lead to military action, a military coup, which is conceivable, I think, in Russia. but I'm not sure that it would lead to a better outcome.
Thanks for that. Yes, go ahead, Jim, please.
I wanted to, if I may, just a couple of points on your Russian, how do we explain a Russian approach, Taylor? The first one about coercive and terrifying approach. It struck me, I asked myself this question, and this thought keeps coming over and over. I think that the brutality of the Russians in this conflict is, I don't know, I just think that it might have been displayed to try to break Zelensky and sort of the leadership in Ukraine, because Ukrainian society is, very much, still, leaning toward West, with the democratic and freedom, rule of law values. If it wasn't for Russia, they would be closer to the EU, if not in the EU at this point. So I think they're receptive to that. And I think that perhaps that's a tactic that Putin is employing, trying to break the leadership, because the moment that the leadership breaks, they come to the table, but they come to the table with not much to leverage on, number one. And the third point, and I wanted to hear your point about, your reaction to this idea that just keeps coming back. And that the third point, when you talked about the sort of the individual following orders. So I was recently in Europe, and I kept reading in the news that many Russian soldiers, actually the mothers of these soldiers, were reporting, to journalists that their children, let's call them, had been sort of enlisted under false pretenses and had been told a completely different story. And when they got to where they, sort of by the border, then they were basically faced with the idea that if they didn't follow order, they would be executed. Many of these reports I saw in the media. Now, I don't know how, sort of much of that story, but it doesn't account for the brutality. That's, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Employed.
Just one other thought about this question of nonviolence and mass action, because this is one of these situations that, speaking personally, tests one's commitment to nonviolence. And I'm reminded of a conversation I was part of yesterday in the GSPIA class about mass expressions of support in the United States. And well, mass is stretching because they've been modest, compared to the large numbers of people who've been in the streets in some of the European capitals. And it's probably not hard to understand that, but one factor in that surely is that, we're invited or we're called on social media to come out and quote unquote stand with Ukraine. But stand with Ukraine rings a little hollow when it stops short of standing and joining the fight with Ukraine. And it creates the paradoxical situation where an effective nonviolent anti-war strategy, one way of understanding it was that it would have to be advocating a willingness to go to war. And let me be clear, I'm not advocating that. I'm just puzzling over how we mobilize. How would we mobilize mass action on a scale that would have a chance of making a difference?
So I'm not sure. How's that for an answer? It's hard to imagine that Putin's hold on power could be ended by peaceful protest within Russia. His hold on power is going to be, I think, weakened over time by sustained international effort and weakening the economic market for Russian goods around the world in various ways, and keeping political pressure on Russia from the outside. One of the things that we haven't talked yet about, but I think is fundamentally important, is that we need to recognize that the only way this is going to end is if, not the only way, but one of the more likely ways this will end is if Putin can be given a face-saving way out. He's backed into a corner now, and he's probably going to be backed further into a corner. That raises the possibility of him changing the game and going much wider than just Ukraine. And this is a state against which NATO is arrayed and has been for decades. And it's a state that has nuclear weapons, and we just don't want to go anywhere near that. So that makes a difference in what the options are that we can pursue.
Yeah, interesting you say that, Taylor, because that segues nicely into the another question that I see in the chat, which is speculation about Russia taking over or trying to take over more territory, the titular republics. Do we think this is likely? I mean, do you want to expound a little bit on what you were just saying? I mean, one way to think about this is it would seem to be extremely unlikely because some of these places have different sets of alliances with the West and with Europe than Ukraine did. But on the other hand, as you said, the dynamics of this are such that Putin might be looking for a way to change the structure of the game at this point. So I don't know. Do you have further thoughts on that?
No, not anything useful. I'll just reiterate what we've heard for since the beginning of the conflict, which is that there is the possibility of rapid escalation of the conflict because of Article 5 of the NATO alliance. And the states an attack on one is to be considered an attack on all. And so if Putin decides to expand the conflict, all he has to do is send an aircraft over Poland and drop a bomb, and everybody in NATO is in. So that's a scary thought.
Just seeing if there's any other. We have 10 minutes left, but we may be kind of at the tail end. If anyone else has questions to put in the chat, just kind of make a comment about one of the previous questions and mass protests and nonviolent resistance. I mean, as I tend to tell students, I think social scientists tend to be very good at explaining the dynamics of these protests in the context of overthrow of leaders and revolutions. We're really bad at predicting when they're going to happen, and so these tend to take us by surprise, in part because some of the features of suddenness that go along with protests cascading into gigantic mass protests that can oust leaders from power. So it's not inconceivable that something like that could happen. I share others' extreme skepticism, but these turn on a dime, and we tend to be pretty bad at predicting the conditions under which we're likely to see them. I don't know if anyone else has any questions, or turn it back over to Dr. Owen.
Yeah, I guess maybe if I could mimic the last panel that we had on the Ukraine, I guess if you all wouldn't mind, could you share one thing that you'll be looking at or watching for in the coming weeks? Or something you'll be paying attention to? Oh, yeah, Svitlana, please.
So I'll probably jump. So actually, I saw this question in the Q&A session. It's about the future of Donetsk and Luhansk Republic, this titular republic bordering a Russian Federation. So it looks like officially Russia shifted its presence from Kiev, from central region, more towards the east. So I think it would be quite interesting to see what is going to happen in the east. So whether Russia is going to use more disruptive arms to gain bargaining power about the future of this republic, whether it is continue to shoot rockets and continue bombing infrastructure in the rest of Ukraine. So from the military point of view, I think I would be monitoring what is going on in the east. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I would say that I would add to that and agree with it. But what's going on in the east is going to be very influential for the conflict as a whole. And because it is a potential place where I can imagine an agreement, a diplomatic agreement to try to establish a countrywide ceasefire and then perhaps a lasting peace might take hold, but it would involve, I would guess, Ukraine conceding Donetsk and Luhansk and the peninsula with the warm water port. In other words, a big chunk of the country, giving it to Russia or letting Russia claim that, and then not, then Russia would withdraw its troops. So that the way the war will end ultimately in this scenario is by dividing Ukraine up into two pieces. That's not something that I think anybody believes that the president will tolerate, but it could come to the point where there seems to be no other choice. And in the meantime, we should remember that peace agreements or peace talks are often accompanied by an escalation of violence as the two sides or three sides, however many sides are in the negotiations, try to establish points of power on the ground so that they can get what they're asking for at the negotiating table. So I think that what's going to happen in the East and Southeast is going to tell us a lot about how much longer we can expect this war to drag on.
Thank you for those insights, Taylor and Svitlana.
Yeah, I will. Well, I'll take my cues from the two of you who have spoken and watch those things. But both as a citizen and as a scholar, I'm going to watch closely the follow through on these commitments of receiving 100,000 refugees and donating $1 billion to support and compensate and bear some of the costs that Ukraine's neighbors are bearing. I think it's critically important.
And Paul, I was just going to say, I was struck by your comment on cash assistance, especially since there's been so much difficulty in getting any humanitarian assistance or trucks into some of these regions. So, thanks for making that point. And Gemma, why don't we give you the final word?
And I'll pick up of what one of the latest questions, what would be what do I expect the EU approach, toward migrants is going to be? That's a very good question, but it's one that I really can't answer. I think that we are. That's what I'm going to watch. Frankly, I'm going to watch two things. I'm going to watch every move that the EU does because it is going to be setting a precedent for moving forward in creating migration policies and practices, after this all ends, even in other areas, and particularly in the Mediterranean. So I definitely will be following this very closely. And as many other scholars that follow migration policy are already doing. The second thing that I actually will monitor and look will be political parties in across Europe and how they are going to digest and what the narrative is going to be as the months will go by, because Europe is very and people in general in democratic systems, they're very they're great when there is an emergency, and they're very, the humanitarianism explodes. People, as Paul, your image created, sort of at this point that people are coming from everywhere trying to help. And also here from the United States. And but short term, this will be okay. But long term, I think that we're going to start to see a shift on how people are going to receive this long term, particularly linked with Svitlana, the point about the economic costs, because they're going to be felt. The EU will not be able to address for all 27 countries, the kind of costs that we are facing, especially if this is going to be prolonged for quite a while. So that's what I'm going to watch, those two things.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your expertise. Thank you, Luke, for facilitating and for providing such wonderful questions. And thank you to the audience for being here and for the questions. We really appreciate everybody taking the time to be here today. And we will share a recording of this for folks who were unable to attend. So thank you again. And I hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Erica, for convening us.